study with master notes again. So I think all you are fine. I am also fine. So we will start today MEC 5, your literary criticism. Okay. So literature, criticism and theory we will study. So you have all your IGNOU exams on December 1st week. Okay. So from December 1st week you have all your term and examination. So hope all you are preparing well in your home. So again I will come to literature, criticism and theory and point out every details about literature, criticism and theory and all its key points and short notes. So please students, like, share and subscribe to this channel and comment if you have any doubt and share much more to your friends so that they also know something about literature, criticism and theory. Okay, so today we will start literature, criticism and theory. This is your unit 1. So here it is the structure, objectives, introduction, what is literature, what is literary criticism, what is theory, contradiction, background to the contemporary situation in theory, theory before theory, immediate context, from criticism to theory, the communication chain. Let us sum up questions and suggested reading. So here it is the objectives. So every unit has its own objectives. So today we know what is the objective of this unit. In this unit I want to introduce you to some general concepts related to theory and literary criticism and briefly touch upon the distinction between them. So what is literature and what is theory and literary criticism. I also want to disprove some myths, clear a few misconceptions and try to even dispel the misgivings that may be lurking in your mind about theory. In this unit 2, I propose to chart out the growth and proliferation of theory in the 20th century. Okay. So in this unit 2, I propose to chart out the growth and proliferation of theory in the 20th century. So here it is the introduction. In this section, I want to talk about some words which you use in literary conversation and writing. The questions I ask are what is literature, what is literary criticism and what is theory. In this section, I want to talk about some words which you use in literary conversation and writing. The questions I ask are what is literature, what is literary criticism and what is theory. But before you read the following, try to answer those questions yourself and then see if you and I are thinking along the same lines. Do not worry about the correctness of your answers. So randomly you think what is literature. Okay, so what is literary criticism and what is theory. So in a brief I will discuss about what is literature. So all of you know literature means just an elaboration of something or elaboration in a broad or view of ideas. Okay, that is literature. Then literary criticism, all of you know criticism means criticize. So literary criticism means the criticism applied on literature. Okay, then what is theory? Theories are the postulated some formulas or some kind of information in a systematic manner. Okay, so these are called theory. So what is literature? Sometimes simple questions flummox us simply because we take certain things and ideas about which questions cannot be asked for granted. The question which appears in the form of a heading to this section belongs to that category. One of the easy, always known and yet difficult to answer questions. Nonetheless, let me make an attempt to tackle it and some other related questions. The term literature, as Raymond Williams, with those with whose work you may already be familiar, has reminded you, is of a comparatively recent origin. Okay, the term literature as Raymond Williams. So here it is the main key point you can note down. The term literature as Raymond Williams, with whose work you may already be familiar, has reminded us is of a comparatively recent origin. Originally, it referred to, as indeed it still does, any written printed matter or any subject. We still refer to medical literature, talk about availability or otherwise of literature on a subject, etc. Earlier, it signified something similar. It is from this source that the term literate was derived. Okay, literate was derived. Sometimes in the 19th century, it began connoting specifically what was earlier covered under the broad rubric of poetry. Okay, so earlier 19th century it began connoting specifically what was earlier covered under the broad rubric of poetry. As an academic discipline, classics and rhetoric preceded it. Okay, as an academic discipline, classics and rhetoric preceded it. Literature's critical meaning is still visible in the use of the word literature. Okay, as an academic discipline, classics and rhetoric preceded it. Literature's critical meaning is still visible in the use of word literature. Matthew Arnold, 1822 to 1888, gave it the final seal of this current meaning in his famous essays. So, who gave it the final seal of the current meaning in his famous essays? So, the answer is Matthew Arnold, that is 1822 to 88. Okay. So, gave the final seal of the current meaning in his famous essays. Now, in its specialized use, it means what poetry used to signify in earlier times. It includes all imaginative writing, poetry, fiction, and drama. The rise of the notion of literature is intimately related to the growth of the print industry when texts were easily duplicated in the wake of the steam-run printing machines during the Industrial Revolution 750 to 1850 in Europe. Books became commodities as the capitalist market economy generated a middle class which had the leisure and the literacy to read books. The idea of literature grew along with another allied concept, that of culture. I am tempted to draw a simple relationship between this agriculture, industrialization, leisure, literature, and culture. So, what is literary criticism? This too is one of those awkward questions about which I have already told you. When someone asks you whether you like a particular book, a novel, a short story, and you say yes or no, you are the threshold of literary criticism. When she asks you why, then your attempt and answer trying to rationalize your perception. You are doing literary criticism, albeit at a rudimentary level. Similarly, you do film or art criticism. Understanding and interpreting literary experience, even when not articulated, can be literary criticism. Now, this can be an amateurish response. Alternatively, it could also be a highly sophisticated professional one of the kind we generally read in review columns and journals. English poets and critics whose works you read have battled over the question of the relative superiority or otherwise of criticism over creation. Wordsworth and Arnold, for example, some enduring criticism has also come into being by way of defense of poetry. You already know of some these such as Sidney's 1554 to 1586 and Shelley's 1792 to 1822 essays. The classical criticism of the Greeks and Romans grew around attacks on and defense of the position of poets in a civil society. Aesthetics and poetics were terms that are earlier used before the vogue of criticism set in. So here it is the main key point you can note down. What are the earlier terms used before poetry? That is aesthetics and poetics. Okay, aesthetics and poetics were terms that were earlier used before the vogue of criticism set in. You can find brief histories of such common words in Raymond Williams' book entitled Keywords. And then more recently, theory was introduced into our departments. So what is theory? Let me try to define the term theory for you. You can, if you like, make necessary changes. Very generally speaking, a theory provides a system by which experience can be organized and made sense of, or at least into something which will be comprehensible. All theories are constructed against the threat of chaos, which is the absence of system and organizing principles. To make sense of what comes to us, however provisional and imperfect that sense may have to be. That is the basis of all dogma, religious and political alike. Okay? So that is the basis of all dogma, religious and political alike. So all theories are constructed against the threat of chaos, which is the absence of system of organizing principles. To make sense of what comes to us, however provisional, imperfect that sense may have to be. That is the basis of all dogma, religious and political alike. What applies to life also applies to our experience of works of art. How does a work of art mean what it means? How do we make sense of work, whether it be a literary or non-literary text? Under what conditions is meaning produced? Literary theory as we know it owes its origin to human attempt to deal with these issues. Where does meaning lie? In the text, in the mind of the reader, does the author use the form of the poem or novel as an empty receptacle, which she then fills impregnant like the heavenly muse, dove-like, as Milton says, with meaning? What effect does it produce in the mind of the reader? Does the subjectivity of the reader determine or contribute to the meaning of the work of art or literature that she is exposed to? Or is meaning an objective reality having an ontological status? Does the reader make special attempts to get at the meaning immanent in the text? You can see these are clearly philosophical issues. The philosopher asks similar questions about objective and absolute reality, whether the tree that I see or touch is the reality. In their philosophical writing, Hobbes 1588 to 1679 and Locke 1632 to 1704 talk about wit and judgment and illustrate their general theory by referring to, among other categories of knowledge and history. Okay, so in the philosophical writings, Hobbes and Locke. Okay, you should memorize these two names. That is Hobbes and Locke. Okay, so Hobbes and Locke in 1588 to 1679 and Locke 1632 to 1704 talk about wit and judgment. So who talked about wit and judgment? That is Hobbes and Locke. Okay, Hobbes and Locke, philosophical writing Hobbes and Locke, and illustrate their general theory by referring to, among other categories of knowledge like history, poetry. Hobbes says in a good poem both judgment and fancy are required. Judgment without fancy is wit, but fancy without judgment not. The 18th century philosopher Kant 1724 to 1804 had talked about aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment. Okay, so the 18th century philosopher Kant had talked about aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment and described it as purposiveness without purpose. Wordsworth 1770 to 1850 theory of literature in his preface to the lyrical ballads is as much literary criticism as theory, the romantic theory of poetry, had talked about aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment and described it as purposiveness without purpose. Aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment and described it as purposiveness without purpose. Okay, aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment and described it as purposiveness without purpose. Aesthetic judgment as opposed to moral judgment. Wordsworth 1770 to 1850 theory of literature in his preface to lyrical ballads is as much literary criticism as theory, the romantic theory of poetry. So here it is the very important point. Wordsworth 1772 1850 theory of literature in his preface to the lyrical ballads is as much literary criticism as theory, the romantic theory of poetry. Instead of making a contradictions between theory and criticism, one can perhaps talk about practice as an antonym to theory. Okay, theory and criticism. one can perhaps talk about practice as an antonym to theory. Practice as an antonym to theory. So we often come up with statements like, in theory this sounds alright. So we often come up with statements like, in theory this sounds alright. But in practice it is impossible to achieve. Criticism, one can perhaps talk about practice as an antonym to theory. So we often come up with statements like, in theory this sounds alright, but in practice it is impossible to achieve. Hence the pun is Asa Ahmed's book. Okay. So in theory this sounds alright, but in practice it is impossible to achieve. Hence the pun in Asa Ahmed's book in theory. Hence the pun in Asa Ahmed's book in theory. I am reminded of the title of one of Ezra Pound's 1885 to 1972 books, How to Read, which, that is the phrase, not the book, can be used to define what we understand by theory. As long as we go on talking about how to read, we are doing literary theory. Once we start reading a text in accordance with those dicta, we are doing literary criticism. Once we start reading a text in according with those dicta, we are doing literary criticism. So here you can see, in accordance with those dicta, okay, dictations to dicta. Okay. Once we start reading a text in accordance with those dicta, we are doing literary theory, literary criticism. It might be helpful in this context to recall what David Laws says. Literary critics, he says, have since the 1960s shown a much greater intent in and anxiety about the theory of their own subject. Okay. So Aristotle Poetics then was formerly the case, at least in Britain and America. He further says literary criticism has been drawn into the cortex of a powerful new field of study in which all disciplines are merged and interfused, and which goes under the general noun of theory. We will examine more of this and also the subtle distinction between criticism and theory presently. So David Laws says literary critics, he says, have 1960s shown much greater intent, anxiety about the theory, their own subject, that is Aristotle Poetics, than was formerly the case, at least in Britain and America. So David Laws says literary criticism has been drawn into the cortex of a powerful new field of study. So who told the literary criticism is a powerful new field of study? So answer is David Laws. Okay. So here it is the main key point, you can note down. David Laws says literary criticism has been drawn into cortex of a powerful new field of study in which all disciplines are merged and interfused. Okay. So, and which goes under the general noun of the theory, and subtle distinction between criticism and theory presently. So David Laws says this. Then contradistinction. By definition in then, you can see the difference between what is generally referred to as theory and what we have always known as literary criticism. The context of literature is the set of broad assumptions about literature, and the function of criticism, when you say, for example, the economic condition of a society, its modes of production and class system in any given time determine the literature of that society, is that given period of its history. You are making a theoretical pronouncement. However, when you start analyzing any work of art or poem or a novel of that society and period from the theoretical perspective, you are doing literary criticism. Okay. So economic condition of a society, production class system in a given determined time, literature of the society, you can know. Okay. So when we start analyze a poem or novel of that society and period from that theoretical perspective, you are doing literary criticism. This kind of reading of literature is of course known as Marxist criticism, and that is literary criticism where you have applied the Marxist theory of literature, and you may have done it yourself without knowing it. Reading in this sense is purposive reading with theory in mind. Literary criticism, you may say, thus is applied theory. Secondly, or to put the same thing in a different way, whereas the object of literary criticism is any given particular literary work, that of classical poetics or contemporary theory is usually generalization about literature. Invariably, in the second, which leads to the practice of the first, this indeed is what scientific method is all about, from the particular individual case studies to general. Classical poetics or contemporary theory is usually generalization about literature. Invariably, it is the second which leads to the practice of the first. This indeed is what scientific method is all about, from the particular individual case studies to the general. And then application of general principles or theory to the individual or particular works. Then the application of the general principles or theory to the individual or particular works. For some reason, the term theory as opposed to literary criticism came into vogue when structuralism and post-structuralism opposed new criticism. For some reason, the term theory as opposed to literary criticism came into vogue when structuralism and post-structuralism opposed new criticism. In this sense, theory is used to describe a wide range of approaches from the Marxist to the deconstructionist school. But as early as 1957, Wimsatt and Brooks used the term theory in referring to any broad assumptions about literature, even in the case of the works of classical writers such as Horace, 65-8 BC, or medieval writers such as Thomas Aquinas. They refer to Horace as a literary theorist. They also talk about how literary theory and criticism received a new emphasis in Italy during the phase of general Renaissance, which was speeded by the Western movement. What Horace says about certain literary works, their relative merit or demerit, is criticism, but surely he says all this with certain broad assumptions in mind or even expressed ones. As Wimsatt and Brooks says, the main thing assumed in criticism of Horace is the normative value of literary species. But when we talk of theory, or even for that matter, whenever we talk about theory, what we have in mind is the more recent phenomenon of doing theory. That is to say, the structuralist and post-structuralist turning in literary criticism, from Marxism to deconstruction, from Foucault to the speech act theory, is an academic phenomenon of the second half of the 20th century. In addition, theory has broken the disciplinary boundaries between various academic disciplines. In addition, theory has broken the disciplinary boundaries between various academic disciplines. Background to the contemporary situation in theory. In this section, I try to give historical reasons for the rise of the theory in latter half of the 20th century. Naturally, this history will be my version of what happened, which will be colored by whatever history I have read and heard from others. You must not take for granted indiscriminately all that I saw by way of generalization and simplification. Ironically enough, this kind of skepticism questioning that I recommend is also the result of developments in theory. In subsequent blogs, you will be told about subject positions, interpolation, and so on. Also, questions of historiography have contributed to this kind of skepticism. Let me then proceed with my version of what happened in the earlier decades in English studies. Until the first quarter of the 19th century, higher education in England was a monopoly of the Church of England and confined to Oxford and Cambridge. These two ancient universities were like all main monasteries in the form of colleges. The teachers were unmarried churchmen, and like them, students were all housed in the colleges. Ancient Greek and Latin literature, divinity, and mathematics were the subjects of study. In 1826, a university college was for the first time founded in London, opening up facilities to men and women of all regions. From the 1828, English was offered as a subject for study, and the first English professor was appointed in 1829. However, it was English language rather than literature which received the main thrust. The inclusion of literature came about 1840 when F.D. Morris was appointed professor at King's College. He said that Arnold was to take up programmatically later the study of English literature, he said, would serve to emancipate us from the notions and habits which are peculiar to our own age. He also stressed on fixed and enduring values that literature highlighted. He also stressed on fixed and enduring values that literature highlighted. This can be taken as the central tenet of liberal humanism with an appeal to high moralism supposedly beneficent to humankind. The apparent absence of political motive or ideology cannot stand a moment's scrutiny because both the Morris said that Matthew Arnold made a lifelong crusade were indicative of the threat that rising working class forces posed for the traditional ruling class. English was to be a substitute for religion now that faith had given way to doubt and religion had all but lost credibility. With its ideological baggage depleted, religion had to be replaced by a new ideological baggage. Hence Arnold's prophecy that poetry would replace religion. We will soon see how Eliot's and the new critics' conservatism and Levy's appeal to literary values will make last-ditch attempts at saving liberal humanism from growing attacks from rival camps, mostly from the political left, which had already dubbed religion as the opium of the people. If you want to know more about this, you must read such books as The Social Mission of English Studies 1848 to 1932 by Chris Burdick and Rereading English edited by Peter Widdowson and The Rise of English Studies by D.J. Palmer as well as The Movement of Scrutiny by Francis Mulhern. Theory before theory. The theory that ruled the world of literary criticism without purporting to be theory was or has been known as liberal humanism. Here are some of the basic tenets of the creed which Peter Barry lists in the book Beginning Theory. The literary value is transcendental. That is, good literature is of timeless significance. Such writing is not for an age but for all time, Ben Jonson had said of Shakespeare. More recently in the 20th century, Ezra Pound has defined literature as news which stays news. So who told news which stays news as to literature? The answer is Ezra Pound. Okay. So who told writing not for an age but for all time? Ben Jonson had said of Shakespeare. Okay. So these are main key points you can note down. In your NET exam also you will get this type of questions. So not for an age but for all time by Ben Jonson, and 20th century Ezra Pound has defined literature as news which stays news. That a literary text contains its own meanings within itself and it does not require an elaborate process of placing it within a context, whether this latter be socio-political, autobiographical, literary, historical. As critics, the liberal humanists adhere to the approach which insists upon the primacy and self-sufficiency of the words on the page, the black marks. That to understand the text well, it must be detached from this context and studied in isolation. Though some pre-theory critics and disagree with such a generalization, that human nature is essentially unchanging, that individuality is something securely processed within each of us as our unique essence. The discipline as a whole believed in what is now called the transcendent subject, which is the belief of the individual, that the purpose of literature is specially the enchantment of life, the propagation of human values, that form and content in literature must be fused in an organic way, so that one grows inevitably from the other. That sincerity comprising truthfulness towards experience, honesty towards their self, and the capacity of human empathy and compassion is a quality which inheres in the language with which literature is made. That what is valued in literature is the silent showing and demonstrating of something rather than the explaining or saying of it. So what is the value in literature? The valued in literature is silent showing and demonstrating of something rather than explaining or saying of it. That the job of criticism is to interpret the text and to meditate between it and the reader. Immediate context. The main impulse towards literary theory as it now comes to us rose in the wake of the modernist movement. As Ahmad says, even the more advanced sectors of English studies during the period between the two world wars were dominated by four main tendencies: the practical criticism of I.A. Ricards, the conservative monarchist quasi Catholic criticism of T.S. Eliot, some elements of avant-gardist modernism, which nevertheless remained much less theorized in the English-speaking countries than in continental Europe, and then newly emergent new criticism of Ransom, Tate, and others in United States. The resistance to such exclusivist and technicist, that is emphasizing technique criticism, developed in England first, where there was an older tradition of socially conscious literary study. You must not be perturbed by such jargon and neologisms as educationist and technicist, as they are coined from the simple words you use, exclusive and technical. F.R. Lewis instituted and led the scrutiny group by assimilating some of the pedagogical strategies of practical criticism. Just as this latter, developed and sponsored by I.A. Ricards, had made special attempts to make a science of literary criticism, and a strong plea for eliminating subjective appreciation of literature or poetry. Lewis' close reading also made an attempt to define objective criteria for literary analysis to displace the aristocratic notions of literary taste, while trying to locate the new taste of English literature in the larger story of English social life. Ironically enough, the whole scrutiny enterprise has been seen in more recent times as itself being part of a conservative bourgeois undertaking. As I recount later, this is an episode in the history of the rise and mission of English. This history has been encouraged at last in part by cultural studies of Raymond Williams, who was influenced by Marxist intellectual movement of his times. Frank Lentrisier, who has tried to trace the history of theory in his book After the New Criticism, says how by about 1957 the moribund condition of the new criticism and the literary needs it left unfulfilled place us in critical void. Even in 1940s, however, those triumphant times of the new criticism or theoretical opposition was quietly gathering strength, whereas the new critics concentrated on the taste as an autonomous entity. The new opposition tried to absorb the isolated taste into large mythic structure. Northrop Frye, in his Anatomy of Criticism, made the decisive break with a new critical past observing scattered dissidents. While carrying out his critical theoretical mission, Frye made a series of anti-new critical remarks and called the new criticism the aestheticist view. The new critics, he said, behaved as if they were in possession of special techniques which enabled them to engage in vaguely sacramental activity. He described the activity as made up of cryptic comment and ritual gesture which were too occult for comprehension. Frye's purpose was, as Geoffrey Hartman was to say, to democratize criticism and demystify the muse. If you were untitled in contemporary theorists and have been reading them now trying to understand their work, you might think how silly it was on their part to think the way. But many students in those decades were in awe of their teachers who taught new critical way. They thought of their teachers as people who possessed special knowledge of hidden meanings of taste to which they, the students themselves, had no clue. You may now be inclined to say the same thing about the theorist, especially if you are among the uninitiated. But the actual democratization has taken place in the shape of the large number of critical theoretical practices you now can choose from. Many such backward glances during the mid-20th century saw a correspondence between the new critical practices and the growth and evolution of literary modernism. A case in point, Eliot and the highly influential role that he had other modernist poet critics played in changing the course of English literature and literary criticism. Okay, so Eliot claimed that his criticism was the byproduct of his poetry works up. Okay, so here it is the main key point, you can note down. Eliot claimed that his criticism was the byproduct of his poetry works up. His early essays, he said, try to justify and defend the kind of poetry he and his friends were writing at that time. Truly enough, his early essays such as Tradition and the Individual Talent emphasized impersonality in art. Simultaneously, when he talked about the function and tools of literary criticism, he valued comparison and analysis and chided biographical and historical criticism. However, Eliot often contradicted himself. The critics who came to value modern poetry, such as I. Rickards, severed the text from its context and called such analysis of poetry without any reference to the poet's life or times. Practical criticism poetry thus became the dominant subject for criticism, so much so they returned to the classical tradition of calling all literature poetry. Shakespeare's plays were also looked at as poems. From criticism to theory, Aizaz Ahmad begins the introduction to his well-known book In Theory by saying that the notable development in literary studies as these have evolved in all the English-speaking countries over the past quarter century, as so is the proliferation from a great many critical positions of what has come to be known simply as theory. This explosion of theory is due to radical disagreement over interpreting almost every social cultural phenomenon. Whereas social scientists evolved theories earlier in order to tune their investigation to scientific methods, literary critics took their cue from the social scientists, and the social scientists included literature in the broad scope of their investigation. By criticism, then, what we need to understand in the context of free theory is what has come to be known as the liberal humanist tradition. In fact, liberal humanism stands as an antonym to theory, though I should think that the former is itself a theoretical position. Let me explain briefly to you what I mean by this. Though most of the new critics were conservative in their ideological stance, many others were liberal humanists. As early as 1930s, Rene Wellek and F.R. Lewis debated such fundamental issues such as the relationship between philosophy and literary criticism in the latter's journal Scrutiny. Wellek pointed out to Lewis his dissatisfaction with the position of literary criticism being carried out without a teaching of larger philosophical arguments and thus in theoretical vacuum. What he actually complained of Lewis' reading of the Romantics was that Lewis had not stated his assumption more explicitly and defended them substantially. The works of all the figures discussed in this section can be found in the collection of English critical text D. J. Enright and Hans de Siqueira, Oxford University Press. It is perhaps unnecessary to supply a full-scale example of humanist practice, since the practice will surely be familiar to whoever is reading the book. Then we will go the communication chain. Before I end this unit, I want to draw your attention to an important concept which helps us to differentiate between various theories. This is the communication chain. Roman Jakobson, pronounced Jakobson, has given us a convenient structure of the communication chain by looking at art or literature as an act of communication. It is a tripartite structure which can be represented through the following sketch. That is the addressor, author, context, then code, text or message, then addressee, reader or reader's context. You will notice that critics and theoreticians have tended to concentrate on one of the three parts of any given literary work. Though no reading or theory can strictly and exclusively confine its attention to one of the three nodes, it is the assent on one or the other of the three that lends its character to a theory or reading. Some critics concentrate on the analysis of the text itself and exclude all considerations of the author's biography or historical situation. Exclude all consideration of the author's biography or historical situation. Some other concentrate on the author's life and times, and yet others on the reader's own perceptions. The third almost deny the objectivity of the text, even the existence of the author. Hence, such title as "Is there a text in the class?" or "The death of the author?" or "The birth of the reader?" So let us sum up. I have this unit tried to analyze the subtle and not the subtle distinctions between literature and criticism. As all literary criticism and theory, we saw that theory, that is impulse towards thinking about the act of literary criticism or judgment, was always there. That there was a time when some critics acted as if they did not use any theory. That liberal humanism, which is often foisted as an alternative to theory, is itself a theory. I have further tried to trace this unit a brief history of how criticism has given way to theory in 20th century, and particularly isolated the non-literary consideration ideologies which went into the making of free theory criticism. Then the questions: what would your answers if you are confronted by the question, why do you like particular piece of writing? What is the difference between critic and criticism? Think about this and write your answer. List some of the critical theories and theorists you have come across. Write short notes on what you think about their approach. Do you believe that theory helps us understand literature better? Then is the suggested reading. Okay. So in this way I covered the unit 1. So you will go through it, and hope all you are taking note in your notebooks. So thank you viewers.